As Rachel mentioned, I'm the legislative director for Texas Right to Life, and we are in the middle of legislative session. So we have a small window every other year to pass pro-life legislation dealing with patients' rights and medical ethics, as well as stopping elective abortion. And so we are in that small window of 140 days every other year where we get to pass legislation. And so we have been in session since January, and it is crazy for our legislative team. We have 6 full-time lobbyists who are in Austin, and our office is right across the street from the Capitol, and we're constantly running back and forth, doing meeting with elected officials, representatives, and tomorrow is actually the bill filing deadline. And so everyone in the Capitol is frantically running around trying to get their legislation filed before the deadline. So it's been a hectic few days, but it's refreshing for me as a bioethics student and as a thoughtful pro-lifer to come and talk to you tonight about stuff that matters. Not in the Capitol debating who gets credit for what, or did we tweet out a thank you to this elected official, and dealing with the egos. Actually getting to get down to some issues of substance with medical ethics. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is pro-life medical ethics. And you just do what you got to do. Okay. And so medical ethics kind of deals with our personal decision-making whenever we are making decisions for ourselves or our loved ones. It also deals with things like what should be allowed when it comes to reproductive technologies. Should we allow for embryos to be created in the lab? Should we put restrictions on that? And then it also has things about how should a hospital function? How does it respect patients when it comes to things like informed consent, making sure that patients are fully informed on the decisions that they're making before big decisions. All of those types of issues and more are covered in medical ethics. Now, the medical ethics today is controlled by a field called bioethics. And contemporary bioethics is a relatively new academic field, probably around from the 60s or 70s. And this was a new way of talking about the duty of a doctor, how medicine should treat patients. How do we protect the individual from society and society from the individual? So contemporary bioethics, it's this new multidisciplinary field that kind of rose in response to some public scandals, things like the Nuremberg trials, after we saw when Nazi scientists started doing what they called medical experiments, but in reality it was just torture, and it was just inhumane treatment of other humans. We also saw things like the Tuskegee experiment here in the United States. And then in the 70s and 80s, we saw several public end-of-life lawsuits like Quinlan and Cruzan that rose questions about patients' rights and what is the proper relationship between a patient and the surrogate and a doctor who is recommending withdrawing treatment maybe or continuing treatment further than the patient would like. So all of these things kind of came up, and this new way to engage these questions called bioethics rose to the front. And you also had the innovative medical technology developments like kidney dialysis machines, new medical interventions that raised new legal and ethical questions. There weren't enough kidney dialysis machines for every patient who wanted one. And so how do we determine who gets the dialysis machine? Things like in vitro fertilization were brought to the market. Organ transplantation was perfected, and now there were a lot of ethical questions around organs. So around transplanting organs. So around this time of the 60s, 70s, 80s, all of these things can kind of come together, and you have a new field of bioethics. And so now this new field of dealing with these questions was obviously not built on a Christian worldview. This new field was not built on natural law or even traditionally predominant ethical traditions. ethical theories or traditions that had kind of controlled these discussions for hundreds of years. Now we have something new. And in bioethics, it was dominated by something called principlism. That these bioethical principles are actually what guides how we determine what is right and wrong. And so in bioethics, they came up with these general principles that are very shallow, but they're a consensus. They're kind of general things that everyone can agree we should think about when we're making a decision. If we're determining if a doctor can make a medical decision for you to end your life, what does the principles say about this? So the bioethics, when you talk about bioethics, there's these 4 main principles, and these are like the 10 commandments of bioethics, except there's the 4 commandments, I guess. The first one is respect for autonomy. Respect for autonomy. It is this vague no decisions, and my wife comes in as a surrogate. What are the guidelines? What are the limits on what she knows I would have said about this, right? So substituted judgment. All of these questions fit under this category of respecting the autonomy of the patient, making sure that the patient is fully informed. There's debates about how much information is enough information for a patient to make a decision, right? All of that fits under this general category in bioethics of respecting the autonomy of the patient. We also see that the second principle is non-maleficence, that anyone in the medical field, doctors, nurses, bioethicists, philosophers, they have to agree to this notion of non-maleficence, which is just a fancy way of saying do no harm. That at the very least, the medical profession is not to do harm, whether it's in a research setting, doing medical research, and that was one of the problems with the Nuremberg, the Nazi scientists. They were doing harm in order to accomplish what they thought was good, but it wasn't good for that patient. It was good for society as a whole. So it was a maleficent type of research. But the principle of non-maleficence is at the very least, we make sure we're not doing harm. So this is where the question of killing versus letting die, where that fits in to the ethical debate. The third principle is beneficence. So not just don't do harm, that shouldn't be the top goal of our doctors is just, well, at the very least, I won't hurt you. No, the goal of a doctor is to be beneficent, to do good for you. So not just a negative thing, I'm going to try not to hurt you, but the positive, I'm going to actually try to benefit the patient, desiring the good for the patient themselves, promoting the welfare of the patient. This is where the notion of best interest comes in. When a doctor is thinking about, I could offer these things, I could do these procedures, but what is actually in the best interest of the patient? The patient themselves, not society at large. And then the last one is probably the most vague and the hardest one in the tradition is justice. Justice is one of the main principles of bioethics, and so this is where they discuss fairness and equity. We talk about entitlements, questions about what rights do we have? Do I have a right to health care? Do you have a right to expect me to donate an organ? These are kind of the justice questions of weighing the rights and the duties of different parties. That's where the principle of justice comes in. Now, there's nothing wrong with these 4 principles in bioethics, right? These are consensus, and actually they're so vague that it really depends on who you ask what exactly they mean. What does it mean to respect the autonomy of a patient? Is there any limits on that? Now, there's nothing wrong with these overall, but these cannot be the full ethical considerations that we have when we're talking about how we make medical decisions, what we would determine the limits on medicine are. Especially as pro-lifers, we have moral convictions. We have more kind of deeper, more textured moral convictions when it comes to making decisions for our loved ones, when it comes to determining what should be allowed or what should be prohibited by scientific endeavors. We have more to say, not less than bioethics. And so you can kind of think of these principles, there's nothing wrong with them, but they serve kind of as the floor of our medical ethics, not the ceiling. This is at where we start, not doing harm, respecting the autonomy of the patient, respecting justice. How are we doing, Josh? Okay, do what you gotta do. Yep.
So sorry.
No problem. Now, it's no surprise that for pro-lifers, the most basic principle, the most foundational principle for us is the sanctity of life. That's where we should start as pro-lifers. We don't start with these four vague things. We start with our fundamental pro-life principle is the sanctity of life, or in other words, the dignity of human life. Now, all we say about medical decisions, all we say about reproductive technologies, about organ donation and what biotechnology we should allow, would there be anything ethically wrong with putting computer parts into your brain? Is that something that we should allow for biotechnology, right? These are debates. Is if we could enhance your memory by putting in some kind of computer chips directly into our bodies, is there anything ethically wrong with that? Well, how in the world do we even start to ask that question, right? If we just stuck with bioethics, we would say, well, is it going to hurt you? Okay, because that's the principle of do no harm. Is it going to be to your benefit? Well, maybe better memory is a benefit. Well, is it justice? Would this be equally accessible to all people or just the super rich? What about autonomy? Well, that really just comes down, does the patient themselves want to do that or not? It's as long as they're not comfortable, putting computer pieces in my brain, not very reliable. But again, not exactly the substantial engagement from a medical ethics standpoint, right? But so as pro-lifers, we have more. We have more to say about these issues, and we start with the sanctity of life, or the dignity of human life. Now, it's interesting about the pro-life movement. What's interesting is that we don't have to agree of how we get to this principle of the sanctity or dignity of human life, right? There are many compelling arguments to get here. Now, if you go out on the street, or if you go to your coworker or someone, your next door neighbor, and ask them why they think murder of an adult, a mature adult, is wrong, they'll probably be at a loss of words of, well, it's just wrong. I don't want anybody to murder me, so I definitely don't think we should be allowed to murder others. It's kind of a shallow, most people don't have what's beneath kind of that moral conviction. And that's okay. We can function on this kind of vague moral agreement. If you ask somebody why the terrorist attacks on 9/11 were wrong, they'd say that it hurt people, or it wronged others, or they didn't do anything to deserve it. It would be kind of a shallow kind of moral justification of why something that's obviously wrong, everybody knows it's wrong, exactly why it is. So that's okay, but as pro-lifers, there's several arguments and there's debates about what's the best foundation to get to this, but we start with this principle of the dignity of human life, and we can build on top of that. And most rarely do people have kind of an elaborate philosophical framework for how they got there, and that's okay, but it should be pointed out that at some points that foundation does crack. Just being committed to the dignity of human life is probably not enough for some of the most dynamic questions coming up, especially in our age. Think about all the technological advances of the last 30 years, and then things exponentially are, more issues are coming up. A couple of years ago, there was a debate in the Obama administration about chimeras, mixing animal and human DNA, right? Well, the pro-life movement, there was only a few pro-life voices that were speaking out of how exactly we handle this. There are more issues like that coming up that we need to be prepared for. And if we're just committed to the human dignity, the dignity of human life in and of itself, and don't have even something below that, our foundation is probably going to crack, right? It's not just about having a strong foundation. You can have a house that has a great foundation, and then after some storms and after maybe an addition to the house, you actually start to see cracks up your wall. Well, it's because underneath that piece of concrete, there was sand, or there was shifting gravel, or there were fault lines. It wasn't actually underneath the foundation. So we talk about foundations, but that's really not all. We need a justification, something to support the foundation. Now, here at Texas Right to Life, beneath our foundation that we believe in the dignity of human life, we actually believe that the Christian worldview gives us the best framework, the best ground to put the foundation on. So at Texas Right to Life, we believe, yes, we believe in the sanctity of life. Yes, we believe in dignity of human life. But below that is the doctrine of every human being being created in the image of God. That is the groundwork underneath the foundation. So foundation is good, and I think we can get a long way just on that agreed foundation. But as the building gets taller, as these new ethical questions come up, we're going to have to be honest. Some kind of philosophical, secular explanations of why we should not murder each other kind of break down when you get into some of these weird new questions that we're going to be facing. So at Texas Right to Life, we do believe that every human being is created in the image of God. And I personally believe this is the most defensible, this is the most thorough, the most the best foundation that can hold the most weight. Because we actually believe that this doctrine that all humans are created in the image of God, it kind of gives more texture to this, why humans should be protected, why all humans should be protected, right? So whenever we looked at that list about autonomy, just respecting a patient's autonomy, their self-determination, that's really dependent upon their rational capacity. We're respecting them because they can weigh options. I can put some burdens, and we'll get into this, and some benefits in front of them and say, okay, I'm trusting you as a rationally, independent individual to weigh the risks and benefits and come up with a decision. So I have to respect your process of you determining that. There's nothing wrong with that, but the foundation is, I'm assuming the most important thing about you is your reason, is your ability to make your own decisions, to be self-directed. Well, unfortunately, some of our neighbors, some of human beings aren't that way. Some human beings don't even have the capacity to communicate a rational thought or proposition. So does that mean we don't have to respect them because they can't express their autonomy like other individuals? So you can start to see how even that secular bioethics perspective is go ahead and elevating the rational over the human. And the good thing about humans is actually just that they're rational beings, not necessarily that they were created in the image of God. We believe every human being is created in the image of God, and that's something that's deeper and more substantial than just their being able to make rational decisions. So you think about why do we have a hard time as a society valuing individuals who are unconscious, who have been declared comatose, or who maybe are called brain dead? Well, they're no good anymore. They don't have any autonomy. They're not self-directed, right? So you can start to see is just they lose this one thing in their humanity, and now we're questioning whether they're even worth, whether they have any dignity left, whether they're worth anything. But humans being created in the image of God, that's something that can't be changed. No one can compete with that. If God is the one that created them, no one can uncreate them. No one can come back and change that initial aspect. So when we mean this, the doctrine, I'm not going to go, I'm already going more into detail than I planned, but we mean a couple of things. We mean that humans have some qualities and characteristics of God. We mean that humans have a relation with God. There's a social nature between humans, and there's a social nature between humans and God that makes them in his image. And there's also some functional aspects, as they act like God. They've been given a unique position in creation to exercise dominion over creation. That is a representing God on earth. So my point here is it is a lot more complex than us just saying dignity of humans. Christians should respect all human beings. There's really gravel, solid ground, even underneath the foundation of us just putting the tag of sanctity of life on top of it. And I'm stretching this point because it's important because we are facing a myriad of bioethical issues. So we have our foundation of human dignity, and on top of that, we have part of the structure is beginning of life issues. What do we do with research on embryos? What do we do with in vitro fertilization or emergency contraception? What do we do about abortion? Well, what we believe about these topics at beginning of life have to be built on the foundation of human dignity. The concept that we're committed to that human dignity has to inform all of these. It also has to inform kind of middle life questions like human subjects research. What exactly was wrong with the Nazi medical experiments? Is it just that they didn't get a piece of paper signed by the Jews that were victimized by them? Well, no, it wasn't about consent. It was about decency, respecting that human being as being a human, not a lab rat, right? There's something kind of deeper than just, oh, they didn't do the paperwork. That's really what was wrong with Nuremberg, or with the Nazi medical research. No, it's not about that. So human research, organ donations. Is it okay to take parts of some individual voluntarily to benefit others? Your body is yours, but it's not yours. It was given to you by God. So is that something we can give to others? That's an important question for us to think about. How do we deal with people with disabilities? Our secular bioethics treats disabilities of my body different than the disabilities in my mind. If I have a brain injury, a severe brain injury, well, I'm less of a person than if I just was missing a limb, right? A limb is not as important as my ability to communicate, according to secular bioethics. But a human dignity perspective is no, it doesn't matter what part of your body is injured or disabled. You are still dignified. You are still of infinite worth and value. We also have beginning of life, middle of life questions, but we also have end of life questions. How are we supposed to engage with questions of assisted suicide? What if the patient is asking to die? Well, are we respecting their autonomy to make that decision? Is that the only ethical question we have to ask? No, there's something more important going on we'll get to in just a second. What about euthanasia? Me causing the death of a patient out of beneficence, me wanting what is best for them. I think they're suffering too much. I care for their good, so I'm going to end their life. And then how do we make medical decisions is also in that end of life category. So we have our foundation of human dignity, and so we have this foundation of human dignity, and then we have these little structures on top of it of beginning of life, middle of life, end of life. At Texas Right to Life, we say that we seek to protect innocent human life from fertilization until natural death. And our idea of human dignity has to inform all of those questions. We can't get away from that. So a few high-level points about what I mean by pro-life medical ethics. First is this idea that the individual human being has immense dignity and value, of course. But a correlation to that is that it is wrong, if we believe that, human dignity, then that also means that it is wrong to knowingly introduce the cause of someone's death. It is wrong to knowingly introduce the cause of someone's death. And we'll get to parsing this out in just a second. It also means that we're pro-life, we're not anti-death. It means that we believe in making a distinction between proportional and disproportionate interventions, and we believe that we should honor the autonomy and the dignity of the patient. So first, about causing death. It is wrong to knowingly introduce the cause of someone's death. Now, the most relevant area this distinction comes in is when we talk about active and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia is causing someone to die. It is introducing the cause of their death, like injecting a lethal dose of barbiturates, a drug that would stop the heart of the patient. Okay, that is active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is allowing someone to die, withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment to allow them to pass away. Now, this is an ethically critical distinction that we're making here, active and passive. Think about a cancer patient. And if we think of kind of the health of a patient on a chart, and the health of the patient is maybe this is they're doing fine, they're perfectly fine. And then this patient, we find out, has cancer, and they immediately start to decline in their health towards the bottom of our chart that would be them passing away. This patient is declining, and they get to a point where they can't breathe on their own. Now, if we don't intervene, they will continue that decline and pass away. What if we have this patient who's declining, they get to a point where they can't breathe on their own, and we put them on a ventilator? What we're doing is we're kind of freezing the decline or slowing it down so that now they were going like this, and now we've intervened and we've kind of leveled off. We've maintained. We're going to help them breathe for a while. And there's a slower slope towards them passing away. Now, what if we get to a point where the patient says, I've made my peace, I've exhausted the options, I've prayed about it, I'm okay with continuing that natural decline into death. And so we get to a point where the patient has decided they would like to withdraw that ventilator that was assisting their breathing. So we withdraw the ventilator, and they continue on that decline towards death. Now, when that patient passes away, what was the cause of death? Was it this act of us taking the ventilator away and stop assisting their breathing? No. It was the initial situation, the initial pathology of the cancer. The cancer is what became on this decline. And just because we stopped the decline for a little bit by assisting in their breathing doesn't mean we're causing their death. That's passive. We're letting them die, letting nature take its course, okay? Now, what happens with active euthanasia? You have a cancer patient, right, who begins to decline, and they get to a point where they say, this is too much suffering. Or usually what happens is a doctor says, this is gonna get worse. You're in pain, you're suffering, this is gonna get worse. We can make it better. And they introduce a new intervention, not to maintain, but to force them down into death. The natural course of the disease would have been this slow decline. But whenever they inject the barbiturate, the lethal dose of drugs, they're sending the patient immediately down into death. Now, in that case, what is the cause of death? Was it the cancer? No, the cancer had a trajectory of keeping them alive, taking their life over here, but we've actually intervened and caused their death. So in that situation, what we did caused the death. A helpful phrase is hastening death. Are we hastening death? That's different than allowing a natural course of a pathology or a disease. Now, this is very important because what we're going to get to in just a second in us making medical decisions. In this, talking about passive and active is a very important distinction, but it's also important for us to notice the involvement of the patient themselves. When we respect the autonomy and the dignity of the patient, we have to ask, how involved are they in this decision? Is it a voluntary decision to withdraw that ventilator? Was it non-voluntary, meaning we don't know what they would have wanted? They never talked to their loved ones about it. They never put it in advance directive. Was it non-voluntary, or was it involuntary? They actually said they wanted to continue living, but we couldn't take it. We thought their best interest was something else. So we went against their wishes in an involuntary decision to withdraw treatment. Even if we are allowing a pathology to take its course against the will of the patient, we're not respecting them. We are imposing our values on the patient. So it's very important that the involvement of the patient is always kept up front. Is this patient voluntarily deciding this, or is it a non-voluntary situation? Which is usually the case. We don't know what they would have decided in this circumstance because they've lost consciousness or something. Now, I say that we are pro-life, we're not anti-death. we realize, especially those of us who come from the Christian worldview, we realize that dying is natural and that we don't always have to fight against death with every possible intervention, every additional surgery or procedure possible. Now, this is one thing that some pro-lifers are mistaken in believing that is actually what we have to do to respect life. And some individuals actually say that pro-lifers believe this, but that's not the truth. Respecting the dignity of human life doesn't mean we have to do everything. It means we have to respect the human dignity. We have to respect definitely their decisions, but we do not have to fight against death. For example, I have two children, two young children in elementary school, and I have a wife. And if I knew that I was going to pass away in 6 months, regardless of the interventions that we did, I would not want to leave my wife in a lot of economic debt just because I couldn't, I wanted to try every experimental procedure possible. That would be imprudent for me to make that decision. So I wouldn't want to leave that on her. Now, if there's a reasonable chance that there is a cure, if I haven't, we've explored that, of course, we're not going to give in to death, but I'm also not called to fight death with every possible option. But this is not something a decision I can be making for you. This is not a decision I can be making for someone else about what values and what priorities they would place in this kind of situation. Now, it's important as Christians that we have death awareness, that we think about our mortality. That is part of the Christian worldview and medical ethics. Scripture says that death is the final enemy. But that does not, unfortunately, death is not going to be defeated in an ICU bed. Death is going to be defeated by Jesus Christ at the end of history. So we're not hoping to defeat death in the hospital, right? So that's sometimes where our faith, we're not really thinking that clearly about what it means to be pro-life. It's not that we're anti-death and we have to be naive and think that we're never going to die. No, that's not what we mean. We mean respecting natural death. We actually say it in our mission that we have the appreciation to protect innocent human life until natural death, the cause of death being a natural source, right? Allowing God's timing. That doesn't mean I have to run my family into great debt because I wanted to act like I was immortal. So pro-life, not anti-death. And whenever kind of discerning that, this is whenever that issues of proportional versus disproportional interventions. That's how we determine when we should continue treatment and when we should allow someone to pass away. Proportionate versus disproportionate interventions. Now, the secular bioethics, they focus on benefits and burden, and it's not terrible language, but to think about. But whenever you're looking at, should I do another surgery? Should we continue the ventilator? Should we go on dialysis for your loved one? You can think about, well, what are the benefits of this intervention and what are the burdens of that intervention? Now, I won't go too much into details because I can't put it up on the screen, but secular bioethics have a list of what they think the benefits and the burdens are. And it's interesting because the burdens are things like pain or negative symptoms that result in suffering, cognitive impairment, helplessness, loss of self. These are all financial cost. These are all negative things that could be associated with me saying, I want to do one more surgery, right? A diminished ability to recognize my loved ones. These are things that could be negative outcomes from me deciding to do another surgery. Now, in the benefits side, they said there are several things like relieving pain. That is obviously a benefit of an intervention. If I'm making a medical decision, should I do this intervention? Should I go on this drug? Well, is it going to reduce pain? That's obviously a good benefit. Is it going to improve functioning? Am I going to be able to be aware and to talk to my family? That's definitely a benefit of intervention. But in this long list of potential benefits in this Hastings Center guidelines, a very prominent bioethics think tank, they have kind of this bullet list of potential benefits, and one of them is the opportunity to live longer if the quality of prolonged life is acceptable to the individual patient. And it's amazing to me, as looking at this from a pro-life perspective, that they have a long list of benefits, and kind of hidden in there is the opportunity to live longer. And this is one thing that secular bioethics gets wrong, is they treat life as just one benefit among many. But if you were to ask anyone on the street, what is the purpose of medicine? What is the purpose of a medical intervention? They would tell you to live, to stay alive, to live longer, to have more life, right? And so this just shows you the disconnect of this secular bioethics field, is that they think continuing life is not a good in and of itself, right? This is where the philosophy of quality of life sneaks in. You may hear the doctor or medical professional say something like, yes, yes, this treatment will help the patient continue to live, but they'll have a low quality of life. And they say that as if continuing to live is just one in a long list of potential benefits. Whereas, to most of us, that's, the ultimate, or at least, the penultimate benefit of doing anything in the hospital is continuing to live. So this is just an area where we can't just look at the medical experts. We can't just look at bioethics at how it is now. We have to also make sure we're bringing in our pro-life lens, is that life in and of itself is a fundamental good. Even if a patient is unconscious, but they're still healthy. Even if a patient has a cognitive disability and isn't able to rationally make a decision for benefits and burdens, there's still a value to life. That is a perspective that you and I bring to this very heady academic argument going on in medical literature and in bioethics that is not common in the field. And it's one of these kind of common sense positions and views that is actually mocked in bioethics and by the experts, is that, people come into the ICU and they have to be educated on what the proper benefits and burdens are. And so that's one thing I want to mention is, okay, so they talk about this, but for us as pro-lifers, how do we make these decisions of proportional and disproportional interventions? Well, we ask that question. What are the benefits? What benefits are we hoping to get out of this? So you think about your loved one is there in the hospital and they have a ventilator, and the doctor asks, it doesn't seem like they're going to recover. It doesn't seem like they're going to walk again. They're not going to walk out of the hospital. So what benefits do you want to get from continuing this treatment? So as pro-lifers, we have to think about, what is a proportionate intervention where the benefit is life? Well, what burdens do we think would be okay to undergo? A little bit of pain, continued suffering, impairment of cognitive impairment, loss of autonomy. Okay, they're never going to walk again. Does this person's values think that continuing to live, to have a conversation with their loved ones again, getting to say goodbye to their spouse or children, is that a benefit worth pursuing with this treatment? Most people would say yes. So this is what we mean by proportional and disproportional interventions. There are definitely disproportional interventions. Me living another week unconscious in a bed when I know I'm going to pass away, that may not be a benefit worth pursuing if I feel like my family is ready to let me go. So this is something I personally would need to go with and make a decision in my advance directive and talk to my wife and talk to my surrogate, my medical power of attorney about, of if it is absolutely clear that I'm going to pass away, my decline is inevitable. What is the benefit I'm seeking? Well, there are some benefits. If I'm conscious, definitely, like we said, waiting for loved ones to come into town, having more moments with them, being able to talk to them or even to hear them, respond to them. Those are definitely good benefits. But this is the type of questions we have to ask ourselves when determining what benefits and burdens we are okay with whenever we're making medical decisions. Okay, but then the last one, going back, is yes, we honor that patient because we want to talk to that patient. We want to ask that patient, what are your benefits? Or sorry, what are your values? What are your priorities whenever it comes to these important decisions? We want to honor their autonomy, but we also want to honor their dignity, the dignity of the patient. And humans deserve certain things just because they're human. And just because someone is not going to be conscious or not going to have the cognitive abilities after a treatment or not going to be able to walk again, those in and of themselves are not reasons for us to stop treatment, right? That human, no matter what condition they're in, still has immense dignity and value. So these are kind of a sketch of pro-life, what it means to make kind of not just think about medical ethics in a secular perspective, but thinking about it through the lens of the pro-life perspective. So one thing that I will mention is a pro-life bill that we're working on this session. And I have to just talk about this very shortly at the end here, is that we're in our legislative session right now in Austin trying to pass bills. And there is a bill that deals with these issues, is making sure that we're respecting the patient, their right to life, and their decisions. And so it is Senate Bill 917 by Senator Hughes and House Bill 2609 by Tan Parker. Now, you can find all this at texasrighttolife.com/legislation. On our website, you can see what our priority bills are, and you can see these bill numbers. But this is an area where Texas actually doesn't respect the autonomy or the dignity of the patient, and actually allows a hospital to say, you may think continuing treatment has its benefits. We've decided the burdens are too much for you. We actually are saying it's in your best interest to die rather than to continue life in this state. And so they actually use the principle of beneficence, of I get to define what is in your best interest. And in Texas, we have this where hospitals are making those decisions for patients and withdrawing their treatment, which hastens their death. Whereas the patient or the surrogate there is saying, no, we think prolonged life, we think continuing to live is a good enough benefit for us to keep the treatment on. Whereas the hospital is saying, actually, the law gives us the authority to make that decision for you. And this has happened in Texas. This happens in the famous case of Tinsley Lewis, which you might have heard about up in Fort Worth. You can read more about it on texasrighttolife.com, of the 10-day rule. This is something called the 10-day rule that we're trying to fix in the legislature so that we're respecting, yes, the autonomy of the patient, but at the end of the day, really the right to life of the patient, that they get to say continuing to live is a benefit worth pursuing. And so we're working on that bill. We're hoping to get a hearing pretty soon and to hear those personal stories, to say these are decisions that should be left up to patients and their loved ones, not a hospital committee that doesn't even know the values and the priorities of the patient. So texasrighttolife.com is where you can find that information. If you're interested in hearing updates about the legislative session and about hearings and opportunities to come and join us in Austin, you can text pro-life to 56525, the word pro-life to 56525, and you can find all that information on our website. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. As a reminder, if you have any questions, text those to 833-343-0269. That was 833-343-0269. So our first question is, can you talk a little bit more about quality of life when it comes to medical decision making?
Yeah, so quality of life is kind of the key word, where they say, yes, you can decide to do this surgery or to have this intervention or go on this medicine. You can decide to do that, and you'll keep on living. You'll be alive, but you'll have a lower quality of life. So it's not, the goal of medicine is no longer to keep people alive. It is to keep people alive to a level that we think is valuable. So conscious, able to walk around, able to have a conversation, able to make your own decisions, able to go to the bathroom by yourself. These are some qualities that you have to have attached to the patient in order for them to be, valuable. So the quality of life ethic is antithetical to the pro-life view that we've been talking about, that every innocent human life, every human life has immense dignity and worth. So these are two very stark options of how we can look at medical ethics.
Okay, on top of the bill that you just mentioned that was filed by Senator Hughes and Representative Parker, can you mention just maybe another few of the bills that we're looking at for Texas Right to Life this session?
Yeah. So actually, there's one bill kind of related to this. I mean, the pro-life ethic is, like I said, at the end of life, middle of life, and also beginning. And one area that this comes into is children with disabilities. Whenever a parent finds out that their child has a disability in utero, they do testing and they think the child might have a disability. Well, the secular bioethic answer is to abort that child and try again. That child, may have a disability, so why should we waste the resources, the emotional energy? Why should we waste this? Let's just have a do-over, because that child isn't valuable in and of themselves. That child is only valuable if they're healthy, if they're going to be like you and I, and able-bodied, and able-minded. So that gets into this really pernicious practice of discriminatory abortions, is where we abort children because a potential disability. Now remember, these in utero tests are not 100% certain. We have story after story of families that were pressured by doctors saying, they're going to have this disease, they're going to have this ailment, they're going to have this disability. You should end their life and try again. Maybe you'll get someone who, have a child who is healthy. And then they have the child and they were wrong. The experts were wrong. This child is healthy, and then we have stories of, the child did have that disability, but they're still a human. They're still part of our family. They still bring us great joy and are worth protecting. And so we hear those stories. So one bill is focused on this area, called the Preborn Non-Discrimination Act, or PRENDA in short. And this is a bill that would protect, or would actually ban discriminatory abortions, so abortions that are targeted to children with disabilities. But it also connects these families, if they hear their child may have a disability, it connects them with a life-affirming medical option of perinatal hospice care. There are nonprofits, there are government programs, there are support groups of people who were just like this, saying, yes, my child was diagnosed with that disease and they were born, and this is what our life looks like. Is, yes, it's challenging. The child's in a wheelchair. The child may be on a ventilator around the clock, on their wheelchair, but we wouldn't change anything. We love our child. We think, they're still valuable and worth fighting for. And connecting families to those support groups introduces the pro-life voice into the decision, rather than just hearing the medical experts say, they're not that worth it. They don't have dignity, obviously, because this disability takes their dignity away. And so that PRENDA, Preborn Non-Discrimination Act, is another main bill that we're working on. It goes right into this quality of life, human dignity distinction we've been making.
Great. Well, this concludes our Q&A session for this evening. Thank you so much, John.
Okay,
Let's give him
thank
one
you,
more
Rachel.
round of a hand.